He was already bleeding when he hit the floor. It was 11:47 p.m. on a thick summer night in Los Angeles Koreatown, and Alana Brooks had exactly 4 minutes left on her shift when the back door of the diner exploded open and a man collapsed onto the kitchen tile, leaving a long, dark streak of red behind him like a signature she hadn't asked to witness. 3 gunshots cracked outside. Then 2 more. Alana didn't scream. She didn't reach for her phone. She looked at the man on the floor, looked at the door, and made a decision that would split her life into everything before that moment and everything after. She locked the door, grabbed him by the arms, and dragged him into the pantry. But let's go back. Because 8 hours before that door came off its hinges, Alana Brooks was just a 27-year-old woman trying to survive in a city that charged luxury prices for ordinary dignity. Mama C's diner sat on South Vermont Avenue, wedged between a karaoke bar that ran until 3 a.m. and a Korean massage parlor whose neon sign buzzed and flickered like it was trying to say something important but had forgotten the words. The diner itself was narrow, maybe 1,000 square feet of cracked linoleum, mismatched stools, and laminated menus that hadn't changed since Obama's second term. The kind of place where truck drivers ordered steak and eggs at midnight without checking the price, and elderly Korean grandmothers split a single bowl of seollyeongtang for 2 hours and nobody rushed them. Alana's grandmother, Miss Dolores, had worked here for 19 years. When her knees gave out, Alana took the apron. That was 4 years ago. She told herself it was temporary. It wasn't temporary. Now she was the one who knew the wholesale cost of every egg carton, every block of butter, every jug of cooking oil. She was the one who knew the diner needed at least 68 customers a day to cover rent, utilities, and payroll, and that lately, they were averaging 52. She was the one who smiled at the health inspector like everything was fine, kept the grease traps clean, and quietly prayed that nothing would ever give anyone a reason to look too closely at this place. Because Mama C's didn't have a big landlord with patience. It didn't have savings. It had Alana, a grease-stained apron, and a grandmother who needed her rent paid by the 15th or the building manager on Hooper Avenue would start leaving notes. Tonight, the summer heat had pressed down on Koreatown like a hand on the back of a neck. The diner's single-window AC unit rattled and wheezed. Alana had wiped the same stretch of counter 4 times. Not because it was dirty, but because her hands needed something to do while her mind ran the numbers she already knew wouldn't add up. $180 in the register. Tomorrow's product delivery, $290, cash only. Her student loan payment, 3 days overdue, $147. Miss Dolores's rent, due in 6 days. She glanced at the clock above the pass-through window. 11:43 p.m. 4 minutes. She just needed 4 more minutes, then she could flip the sign, mop the floor, and get home before midnight. She was reaching for the mop handle when she heard it. Not one shot. Not a car backfiring. A rapid, deliberate sequence, the kind of sound that doesn't leave room for doubt, erupting from the alley directly behind the diner. Then shouting in Korean, fast and furious. Then running feet. Then silence. Then the back door blew open. He came in like something the night had rejected. Tall. Pale. Dark hair plastered across his forehead. His shirt. What had clearly been an expensive, tailored piece of clothing, was torn at the left side and soaked through with blood so dark it looked almost black under the kitchen's fluorescent light. He wore no jacket. His shoes, though, even now, even covered in alley grime, were the kind of shoes that didn't belong anywhere near a mop bucket or a grease trap. Italian leather. The shoes of someone who had never once in his life needed to check a price tag. He hit the tile and didn't get back up. Alana stood 6 feet away, mop in hand, every muscle in her body locked. Her mind ran through the options in about 2 seconds flat. Call 911. Police come. They find him here. They ask questions. They look at the diner. They find the expired permits she'd been quietly renewing late. They shut this place down. Run. Leave through the front. Let whatever this is be somebody else's problem. Or 3 more shots outside. Closer now. Voices moving toward the back door. Alana dropped the mop, crossed the kitchen in 4 steps, and grabbed him under the arms. He was heavier than he looked. Solid in a way that spoke of discipline, of a body that had been built deliberately. But he didn't fight her. He pressed one hand against his own side, gritted his teeth, and used whatever was left in him to push with his legs while she pulled. She got him into the pantry. Shelves of bulk flour and canned tomatoes on both sides. She pressed herself against the wall, reached back, and pulled the door shut just as footsteps crunched into the alley outside. In the dark, she could hear him breathing. Controlled, even through the pain. Like someone who had been trained to endure things quietly. Her hand found the wound on instinct, a waitress who'd spent 4 years watching her grandmother wrap kitchen burns, who knew the difference between bleeding that stopped and bleeding that didn't. She grabbed a stack of clean kitchen rags from the shelf beside her, pressed them hard against his ribs, and held them there. He made a sound, not a cry, just a single sharp exhale, and then went still. Outside, someone rattled the back door handle. Inside the pantry, neither of them moved. Neither of them breathed. In the small space between one heartbeat and the next, Alana pressed harder on the wound. Her fingers slipped against the hem of his ruined shirt. And that's when she felt it. Raised lines beneath the fabric, the unmistakable texture of extensive ink work. She couldn't see it. But she could feel the shape of something large. Something deliberate. Something that told her this man was not who he appeared to be. The footsteps outside moved on. The voices faded down the alley. She exhaled. He turned his head slightly in the dark and spoke, formal, quiet, each word placed with precision even as his body went cold with blood loss. Please, asterisk, he said. Asterisk, no hospital. Asterisk. Not a request. Not quite a command. Something in between, the kind of sentence spoken by someone who understood that certain situations had rules, and that hospitals were not part of whatever rule system governed his world. Alana looked at the pantry door. Looked at the blood already soaking through the rags. Looked at this man, expensive shoes, controlled breathing, a body full of secrets inked into his skin. She had spent 4 years keeping her head down. 4 years staying small, staying quiet, staying out of anything that could bring trouble to this diner. And now trouble had dragged itself through her back door and bled on her kitchen tile. She pressed the rags tighter and made her choice. She didn't know his name yet. She didn't know about the fleet of black sedans that would pull into the parking lot by sunrise, or the silver-haired man in an immaculate suit who would step out of the lead car and walk into this diner and do something no one in Koreatown had ever seen him do before. She didn't know that the man bleeding in her pantry was Min-suk, only son of the most feared Jopak patriarch on the West Coast. She didn't know that in Korean organized crime culture, Insan, a life debt, is not a courtesy. It is a bond. Absolute. Generational. Unbreakable. She didn't know that by hiding him, she had just stepped out of the invisible life she had worked so hard to build. All she knew was the weight of the rags in her hands. The sound of his breathing steadying in the dark. The smell of blood and bulk flour and the distant wail of sirens moving away from this block, not toward it. For now, that was enough. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going, asterisk. The diner had a sound at closing time that Alana had memorized the way other people memorized songs. First, the coffee machine finished its last cycle and clicked into silence. Then the refrigerator compressor behind the counter kicked up half a notch, filling the space the coffee machine left behind. Then the AC unit in the window, the one that maintenance had promised to replace for the past 2 years, began its nightly argument with itself, a rhythmic rattling that started low and built towards something that never quite resolved. And underneath all of it, like a pulse the building had developed on its own, the bass line from the karaoke bar next door thumped steadily through the shared wall, indifferent to the hour, indifferent to everything. Alana knew all of it. She knew it the way she knew the weight of a full dish tray on her left shoulder versus her right. The way she knew which stool wobbled and needed to be approached from the left side, which booth had a spring that caught on your apron strings if you leaned in wrong, which stretch of counter near the register had a soft spot in the linoleum that flexed slightly underfoot and had been flexing that way for at least 3 years without anyone doing anything about it. 4 years of closing shifts. 4 years of this particular soundtrack. She could have conducted it from memory. Tonight was a Wednesday, which meant the karaoke bar ran quieter than a Friday but louder than a Tuesday, and the last real customer, a construction worker named Gerald who always ordered the same thing, 2 eggs scrambled hard, wheat toast, black coffee, and always left a $1.50 tip regardless of his total, had pushed back from his stool at 11:20, dropped the bills on the counter without counting them because he never needed to, and walked out into the heat without a word. Not unfriendly. Just finished. Alana cleared his plate, wiped down the counter, and began the mental math she did every night whether she wanted to or not. The register had $183 in it. Tomorrow morning, the produce delivery came at 7, Hector from Valley Fresh, who accepted nothing but cash and did not negotiate and had never once in 4 years been late, and that delivery cost $290. Which meant that between now and 7 in the morning, $107 needed to materialize from somewhere, and the somewhere was currently unclear. She had $38 in her checking account. She knew the number without looking because she had looked at it 6 times today. Her student loan servicer had sent 2 emails and 1 text in the past 72 hours. She had read none of them, because reading them did not change the amount owed, only increased the specific quality of dread she carried in her chest, and she had learned to manage that dread by not feeding it additional information. Miss Dolores's rent was due in 6 days. $640, paid to a building manager on Hooper Avenue named Mr. Patel, who was not unkind but who was also not a charity, and who had made clear last month that his patience had a shape and that shape was not infinite. Alana wiped the counter again. The counter was clean. She wiped it anyway. Mama C's diner had been in South Vermont for 11 years. The original Mama C, Cecilia Monroe, who had grown up in Compton and worked restaurant kitchens for 22 years before she saved enough to open one door with her name above it, had died of a stroke 8 years ago, leaving the diner to her daughter, who ran it for 2 years, burned out, and sold the lease to her cousin, who had hired Miss Dolores as the day shift anchor and let the place run mostly on habit and regulars and the particular stubbornness of small businesses that had been in a neighborhood long enough to become part of its furniture. Miss Dolores had worked here for 19 years total. When her left knee finally said no more and her doctor said the same thing with considerably more paperwork, she called Alana, who had been 23 and waitressing at an Applebee's in Inglewood and taking night classes at Cal State LA and telling herself she was building towards something larger. Just for a little while, Miss Dolores had said. Until I'm back on my feet. The knee never fully came back. The night classes had, eventually, quietly, been dropped. And Alana had stayed. Not out of defeat exactly, but out of the particular gravity of family obligation, which didn't announce itself as a trap until you were already inside it and had come to love the shape of the walls. Now she was the one who negotiated with the produce supplier. The one who knew that the diner needed 68 covers a day to break even, and that they'd averaged 51 this week, and that the difference between those 2 numbers was not abstract. It was produce delivery shortfalls and late rent and the particular expression on Miss Dolores's face when Alana said, "We're fine," with enough conviction to make it true for a few more days. The diner itself was small and worn in the way that suggested not neglect but endurance. 1,000 square feet of black and white linoleum that had been mopped so many times the pattern was faded in the high-traffic paths between the door and the counter and the pass-through window. 8 booths along the wall, all with the same dark vinyl seating, cracked in places, repaired with electrical tape in 2 spots that Alana kept meaning to fix properly and hadn't. A counter with 6 stools. A pass-through window to a kitchen that was immaculately organized because Alana had reorganized it herself 6 months ago and enforced the system with the quiet intensity of someone who understood that a chaotic kitchen was money leaving through an invisible hole. The menu was laminated and had last been updated in 2019. The coffee was good, this was not accidental. Alana had fought for the coffee supplier over the objections of the owner, a man named Douglas Kim who lived in Pasadena and showed up approximately 4 times a year and whose primary relationship with the diner was the check he deposited monthly from its revenue. And the portions were generous in the tradition Cecilia Monroe had established, the understanding that people who counted dollars appreciated not being made to feel it in the size of what they were served. Outside, through the front windows, Koreatown moved at its own frequency. South Vermont at midnight was not quiet. It was never quiet, not in summer, not in this particular stretch where the karaoke bars and the 24-hour shops and the late restaurants all ran their own parallel lives in the same square mile. Neon in red and blue and yellow reflected off cars moving slowly through the heat. Voices from the sidewalk, Korean, Spanish, English, combinations of all three. The smell of grilled meat drifting from somewhere down the block, persistent and specific, the smell of a city that did not stop eating just because it was late. Alana had grown up 12 minutes from here, in a neighborhood that shared a zip code with Koreatown without fully belonging to it, the way 2 people can share a building without sharing a life. She had spent 4 years learning this particular intersection of worlds. Learning which regular customers preferred to be greeted in Korean and which would feel patronized by the attempt, learning the names of the merchants next door and across the street, learning that the massage parlor on the corner was run by a woman named Mrs. Huang who brought leftover japchae to the diner on the last Friday of every month without explanation, and that this was simply a thing that happened and should be accepted with gratitude and no questions. She had not expected to love it here. She did not think of it as love exactly, even now. But there was something, a sense of having become necessary to a place, of the place having become necessary to her, that functioned like love in most of the ways that mattered. She was reaching for the mop handle at 11:43 when she heard it. Not a car. Not the bass from next door shifting into something percussive. Not any of the ordinary sounds of South Vermont at midnight that her body had learned to file and dismiss without fully processing. This was different. A flat, sharp crack. Then another. Then 3 in quick succession. Gunshots. From the alley directly behind the diner. Alana went still. This was not a conscious decision. Her body made it before her mind caught up, every system going quiet and alert in the same instant, the way animals go still in the moment before weather changes. Then the shouting started. Korean, spoken fast and with a fury that didn't need translation, not an argument, not a negotiation, but commands, urgent and clipped, the kind of language used when situations had moved past the point where words were the primary instrument. She caught fragments through the back wall, movement, a name called twice with increasing desperation, more running. Then a sound she couldn't immediately identify. It took her 2 full seconds to understand it was a body hitting the chain-link fence at the alley's far end. Then silence. Then one more shot. Alana had her hand on the back door handle before she'd consciously decided to go near it. She stopped herself. Pulled back. Stood in the center of the kitchen with the mop still in her grip and told herself very firmly that she was going to do nothing. She was going to turn off the lights and go out the front, and this was not her situation. The product delivery was in 7 hours. Miss Dolores's rent was in 6 days. She had $38 in her checking account. She could not afford to be part of whatever was happening in that alley. She had spent 4 years being part of nothing that could bring the wrong kind of attention to this diner, and she was not going to stop now at 11:44 p.m. on a Wednesday for a sound she hadn't even fully seen. She stood very still and believed in herself. And then the back door opened. He didn't slam it. That was the first thing she noticed, even afterward, when she had time to notice things and arrange them into something that made sense. He didn't throw it open or crash through it the way someone fleeing in panic would. He pressed it open with his shoulder, the way a person would if one of their arms was not fully functional. Careful, even now. Deliberate. He came through the door and made it 4 steps into the kitchen before his legs stopped cooperating. He went down slowly rather than suddenly, one knee first, then the other, then his free hand catching the edge of the prep table in a grip that left a bloody smear across the stainless steel as it slid away. He ended on his side on the kitchen tile, one arm underneath him, one pressed against his left ribs, and he lay there for a moment with his eyes open and his breathing audible. Not gasping, not screaming, but working, measured, like a machine that was running below operational capacity and knew it and was managing the situation with whatever systems remained. Alana stared at him. He was young, late 20s, she thought, though the blood and the controlled expression he was fighting to maintain made it hard to be certain. Pale skin, dark hair pushed back from his forehead and now coming loose, falling forward. He was wearing a white dress shirt, or it had been white. The left side had gone entirely dark with blood, the fabric saturated and clinging, the stain spreading outward in real time in a way that required her to stop processing and start moving. His shoes were the thing that caught her, just for a fraction of a second. She couldn't have said why. In a kitchen with a bleeding man on the floor, she noticed his shoes. They were black, leather, polished to a condition that no alley in Koreatown could fully erase. You could see, beneath the grime, beneath the scuff marks left by whatever he'd run across to get here, the ghost of what they had been an hour ago. Expensive. Not practical expensive. Statement expensive. The shoes of someone who had never once in his life needed to wear shoes that were easy to run in. He looked up at her from the floor. His eyes were dark and very clear, not clouded, not lost. And the expression in them was not fear. It was closer to assessment. He was looking at her the way she looked at the register numbers at the end of a night. Taking stock. Calculating. Please, he said. His voice was quiet and precise, each word placed with care even as his hand pressed harder against his own ribs, even as the blood continued to spread. The English was perfect, but shaped by something underneath it. A formality that didn't come from language learning but from upbringing, from a world where words were chosen rather than simply produced. I need. Voices outside. In the alley. Close. They were moving toward the back door. Alana did not think. Later she would examine this fact, the absence of deliberation, the way the decision seemed to have been made at some level below where decisions were usually made, and she would not know what to make of it. She was not brave by nature. She was careful by nature. She had built her life around the practice of not attracting attention, of not becoming part of anything that required a decision like this one. But the voices were close and the door was right there and the man on the floor was bleeding in a way that would not wait and her body had already decided. She crossed the kitchen, took him under both arms, and pulled. He was heavier than his frame suggested. Solid through the shoulders and back in a way that spoke of discipline, of a body maintained with intention rather than accident. But he didn't fight her, and he didn't go limp on her either. He found whatever was left in his legs, pushed against the floor, and worked with her as she dragged him across the tile toward the pantry at the back of the kitchen. 8 feet. It felt longer. She got him through the pantry door, moved a bulk bag of rice against the wall to give him something to lean against, and lowered him to the floor. He pressed himself back into the corner between the rice and the shelving unit, his hands still firm against his ribs, his breathing still controlled. Alana stepped back out, grabbed the mop she'd left in the middle of the kitchen, and in 15 seconds that she would remember for the rest of her life. Working on pure adrenaline, pure muscle memory, pure refusal to let fear slow her hands, she mopped the blood trail from the back door to the pantry, rinsed the mop head, put it back in the bucket, and stepped back inside the pantry with the door pulled almost shut behind her. She heard the back door handle turn. The door opened. Stopped. The chain she'd thrown without thinking when she came back for the mop had caught. Silence from the other side. Then a voice. Low, controlled, speaking in Korean. Another voice answering. The sound of boots on the step outside. Someone testing the door again, feeling the resistance, measuring it. Inside the pantry, Alana pressed herself against the shelving and did not breathe. 30 seconds. Maybe 40. The longest she had ever spent not breathing. Then the footsteps moved away. Down the alley. The voices faded. She exhaled. From the floor behind her, she heard him do the same. The pantry was narrow. Maybe 5 feet wide and 8 feet deep, shelved on both sides with the bulk dry goods the diner ordered monthly. 50-pound bags of flour and rice. Cases of canned tomatoes and chicken stock. Jugs of vegetable oil lined up in a row along the bottom shelf. Coarse salt in a 20-pound container that Alana used for the fryer and for the eggs and for the sidewalk in the 1 week of the year LA pretended it might get cold. The single overhead bulb was not on. Alana had not turned it on. She turned it on now, a pull chain in the center of the ceiling, and the light was harsh and sudden and revealed everything. He was sitting with his back against the rice bags, legs extended, left hand pressed hard against his left side. His shirt was open at the collar. His jaw was set in the particular way of someone who has decided that an expression of pain is a form of information and has chosen not to provide it. Alana pulled the door most of the way shut and crouched in front of him. "Let me see," she said. He looked at her for a moment, that same assessing look from the kitchen floor, direct and unhurried, and then moved his hand away from his ribs. The wound was in his left side, below the last rib, slightly toward the back. Entry wound, small and dark and clean at the edges in a way she hadn't expected, the surrounding tissue already beginning to swell and discolor. The bleeding was serious but not, she thought, she hoped, arterial. Not the bright pulsing red of something that would empty a person in minutes. Darker. Steady. The kind that could be managed if you managed it fast and didn't stop managing it. She thought of her grandmother's hands. Miss Dolores, who had worked kitchens her whole life and treated a wound the way she treated any kitchen problem, with whatever was on the shelf and the confidence that action was preferable to delay. Alana reached up to the shelf without standing, felt along the second row with her fingers until she found the coarse salt container. Beside it, on the hook inside the pantry door, were the clean rags she kept for kitchen use, thick, cotton, the kind that absorbed rather than smeared. She pulled 4 of them down. "This is going to hurt," she said. "I know," he said. Simple. Prepared. She pressed 2 of the rags against the wound with both hands and leaned her weight into it. He made a sound. Not a cry, not even a gasp, just a brief tightening of the exhale, a compression of sound, and his right hand found the shelving unit beside him and gripped it. His knuckles went white. That was all. She held the pressure. 30 seconds. A minute. The bleeding began to slow, not stop, but slow, the rags darkening with what was already there rather than with new flow. She had one hand still pressing the rags. With the other she reached for the salt. "This is going to hurt more," she said. He didn't answer this time. He simply closed his eyes. Tightened his grip on the shelf. She packed a small amount of coarse salt against the wound's edge, pressing it in with a cloth. His entire body went rigid, every muscle, simultaneously, a full-body clench that lasted 3 seconds and then released, and the sound he made was barely a sound at all. A single note of air, pressed between closed teeth. He did not scream. He opened his eyes again, dark and clear and absolutely present, and looked at her with an expression she would think about for a long time afterward. Not gratitude, not yet. Something more fundamental. Recognition. The look of someone who has registered, at a cellular level, that another person has chosen to stay in a moment that most people would leave. Alana wrapped the wound with the remaining rags, tying them with a strip torn from the end of one, firm enough to hold without cutting off circulation to anything critical. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was pale in a way he hadn't been when he came through the door, the blood loss doing its patient, incremental work. But his breathing was steadier now that the immediate pressure had been applied, and his eyes were still clear, still tracking. "You need a hospital," she said. Not a question. "No hospital," he said. The same words as before, the same precision. "Please." She studied him. Looked at the pale, composed face, the dark eyes that were too alert for someone who'd just been shot, the way he held himself even now, back straight despite the floor, shoulders level despite the wound. The shoes, still visible from the pantry doorway, catching the overhead light. "Then tell me your name," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved across his expression, a calculation, a decision made quickly. Min-suk, he said. She nodded. Didn't push for more. Not yet. She reached back up to the shelf and found a clean cloth to wipe her hands. It was only then, in the mechanical motions of cleaning, wringing the cloth, folding it, setting it aside, that her hands began to shake. Not violently. Just a fine, persistent tremor that she recognized as the body's delayed invoice for everything it had processed in the last 6 minutes without permission. She looked at her hands until the shaking slowed. Outside, somewhere down the alley, she heard a car door close. Then another. Then an engine started, moving away. The sounds faded. The bass line from next door continued its indifferent pulse through the shared wall. The refrigerator compressor hummed. The AC unit rattled. The diner's soundtrack. The same as always. Alana pressed her back against the opposite shelving and looked at the man on the floor of her pantry. At the blood on the rags. At the pale, controlled face above the ruined shirt. She opened her mouth to ask one of the several dozen questions she needed to ask. And then she stopped. Because the overhead bulb, at precisely this angle, hit the gap in his shirt where the fabric had torn at the side, not the wound side, the other side, the right side. And through that gap, in the unsparing light of a 40-watt bulb in a small pantry, she saw the ink. She went still. It was visible only partially, the shirt still covered most of it, but what was visible was enough. The lines were thick and precise, the black absolute, the kind of work that cost money and time and was not done casually. She could see the shoulder of it, the flank, the beginning of what resolved itself, as she looked, into something unmistakable. A tiger. Large. Detailed. The head angled forward in the posture of something that does not need to threaten because it has never had cause to feel threatened. The lines of the face were rendered with the kind of precision that required an artist, not merely a tattoo artist, someone who understood anatomy, who had studied the real animal before putting it on skin. The stripes followed the contours of his ribs in a way that made the creature look like it was breathing. Alana had grown up in this city. She had spent 4 years in this neighborhood. She had listened to things, in booths, over coffee, in the kitchen, in the half-conversations she'd absorbed without seeking them out because this was a neighborhood where certain things were simply known if you stayed long enough. She knew what that tattoo was. Not the tiger specifically, not the exact lineage, the exact family. But the form. The placement. The deliberateness of it. She knew what kind of man wore ink like that and where he wore it and what it meant about where he came from and who had authority over him and who, in turn, he had authority over. She looked at the tattoo. Looked at his face. He was watching her with that same clear, measuring gaze, and she understood, with a certainty that settled into her chest like something heavy being placed on a shelf, that he knew she had seen it. That he was watching to see what she would do with the information. The bass from next door thumped steadily through the wall. Alana said nothing. She reached back to the shelf, found a clean cloth, folded it into a square, and pressed it gently against the top edge of the wrapped wound where the rags had begun to slip slightly. "Hold this," she said. He lifted his right hand and pressed it where she indicated. His grip was steady. She sat back again and looked at him directly. Not at the tattoo, not at the wound, but at his face, at the dark eyes that were still measuring her the way she still measured the register at the end of a night. "You're going to tell me," she said quietly, "what I need to know to keep both of us alive until morning." He held her gaze. And slowly, with the careful precision of someone who had spent a lifetime being deliberate with information, he began to speak. Outside, Koreatown moved in its nighttime rhythm. Neon and bass and the smell of grilled meat and the distant sound of cars on Vermont, indifferent and continuous and unaware that in a pantry behind a small diner on South Vermont Avenue, something had shifted in the particular way that irreversible things shift. Quietly. Completely. Without any ceremony at all. The flour bags sat in their rows. The canned tomatoes stacked in their cases. The coarse salt container stood where it had always stood on the second shelf. And Alana Brooks, who had spent 4 years becoming invisible, sat on the floor of her pantry with blood on her hands and a man who was not what he appeared to be, and listened. The clock above the pass-through window, visible through the narrow gap of the pantry door, read 11:58. 14 minutes had passed since she reached for the mop handle. 14 minutes since her life was divided into before and after. She had not yet fully understood this. But some part of her. The part that had noticed the shoes, that had counted the numbers every night, that had mopped a blood trail in 15 seconds on pure instinct and gotten it right, some part of her already knew. The diner soundtrack played on. The bass from next door. The refrigerator's hum. The AC unit's rhythmic argument with itself. And underneath it all, quieter than any of them, the sound of Min Suk's breathing, still controlled, still measured, still deliberate. Steadying in the dark of the pantry as the salt worked and the rags held, and the worst of it, for now, was past. She pressed her back against the shelving and waited. He spoke the way certain people write formal letters, with the understanding that every word selected represents a choice, and that choices, once made, cannot be recalled. His name was Min Suk. He did not offer a family name and she did not ask for one, not yet. He told her that the alley behind the diner was a route he had used before, not often, but enough to know it, and that tonight it had been known to people it should not have been known to. He told her that the men who had been searching outside were not police, and that calling the police would create a different kind of problem, one that he could not resolve from a pantry floor. He told her that by morning, people would come looking for him, and that those people would be his people, not theirs, and that when they arrived, she should not be frightened. He told her all of this in the same measured tone, each sentence released with the deliberateness of someone who understood that information was currency and was choosing to spend it carefully, in the exact amounts required and not one word more. Alana listened. She did not interrupt. She had learned, in 4 years of diner work, that people told you what they needed to tell you if you gave them the space to do it in their own time, and that interrupting the process usually cost you more than the seconds it saved. When he stopped speaking, she said, "The tattoo." A pause. "Yes. Kangpai." He looked at her for a long moment. She could not tell if he was surprised or simply recalibrating. "You know this word." "I live in this neighborhood," she said. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 4 years. You learn things." He accepted this with a slight inclination of his head, the smallest possible acknowledgement, but genuine. "Yes," he said again. "Something like that." She didn't push further. Something like that contained multitudes, and she understood that those multitudes were not going to be unpacked on a pantry floor at midnight by a man who was managing a gunshot wound with the energy he had left. What she had was enough. Enough to understand the shape of what she was inside, if not yet all the specific dimensions. She stood up, pressed her ear briefly against the pantry door, heard nothing that alarmed her, and then cracked it open 2 inches and looked into the kitchen. The fluorescent lights were still on. The back door was still chained. The blood she had mopped from the tile was gone. She had been thorough, she was always thorough. And the kitchen looked exactly as it should look at midnight, which was to say empty and clean and unremarkable. She pulled the door back to where it had been and returned to her position against the opposite shelving. Min Suk had not moved. He held the folded cloth against the wound with his right hand and kept his back straight against the rice bags with the focused intentionality of someone who understood that posture was a form of information and was choosing to present a specific kind. Even now, on a pantry floor, with a gunshot wound and blood-soaked rags and a 20-pound salt container at his elbow, he looked like someone who was accustomed to the idea that people were watching and drew conclusions. She thought about the shoes again. About the tailored shirt, even ruined. About the precise English spoken with that particular formal cadence that didn't come from textbooks but from households where formality was the standard rather than the exception. She thought about the tattoo. The tiger rendered across his ribs with the kind of precision that was not decoration but declaration. She was thinking about all of this when they heard the voices again. They came back 20 minutes after they had first passed through the alley. This time there were more of them. Alana heard the sound of the chain-link gate at the alley's far end. Not rattled, but lifted, the specific metallic scrape of a latch handled by someone who knew how to handle latches quietly. Then footsteps. Multiple sets, moving with the careful, measured pace of people who were searching rather than fleeing. No urgency now. Methodical. She counted, without meaning to, the way she counted covers during a dinner rush. 3 people moving. Possibly 4. The footsteps stopped outside the back door. She heard voices in Korean. Low, conferring, not the furious clipped commands from before but something colder. Analytical. She looked at Min-suk. He had heard them before she had. She could tell by the way his body had changed even before the footsteps were audible to her, some instinct or experience she didn't have alerting him first. His right hand had tightened on the cloth against his wound. His left hand, which had been resting on his knee, was now flat against the pantry floor at his side in the posture of someone preparing to move if moving became necessary. He looked at her and shook his head. One small motion. Stay. She had not been planning to move. Someone tried the back door handle again. The chain held. A brief exchange outside. She couldn't catch the words, only the tone, which was the tone of a problem being assessed and methods being compared. Then the sound of one set of footsteps moving away from the door and around the side of the building, toward the front. Alana felt the specific cold that is not about temperature. The front of the diner. The sign was still showing open. She hadn't flipped it, hadn't had the chance, hadn't been thinking about signs when a man was bleeding on her kitchen floor. If the lights were still on, if the sign still read open, then from the street, at midnight, Mama C's looked exactly as it always looked at midnight, which was operational, which meant a person could walk up to the front door and pull it and come inside. She stood up. Min-suk's hand moved toward her and stopped itself, a gesture begun and reconsidered in less than a second. He said nothing. He looked at her with the measuring expression and waited. She held up one finger. 1 minute. She moved to the pantry door, opened it fully, crossed the kitchen to the door that connected to the dining room, and moved to the front window without turning on any additional lights. The dining room was lit only by the neon from outside, the ambient red and blue of the street, and the dull orange of the lamp above the register she always left on. She could see the street clearly. A car she didn't recognize was parked at the curb on the far side of Vermont, dark-colored, nondescript, the engine running. 2 men stood on the sidewalk outside the karaoke bar next door, facing away from her, but their body language was wrong for customers. 2 still. Watching the street rather than waiting for a door. And approaching the front door of the diner, 1 man, younger than she expected, maybe early 20s, wearing a dark jacket and moving with the quick, bounced energy of someone running on adrenaline and something else, something chemical, his head swiveling as he walked. He reached the door. Tried the handle. Locked. She had locked the front door at 11:30 on schedule. This she had done before everything else had happened. This one thing had gone right. He cupped his hands against the glass and peered in. Alana was standing 8 feet back in the shadow behind the counter, completely still, and she understood in the 4 seconds that followed what the word invisible actually meant. Not unseen by accident but unseen by decision. She had practiced this her whole life. The art of being present in a room without compelling anyone's attention, of existing at a frequency that didn't register. She had spent years being quietly furious about this particular skill and its implications and what it said about the world that had required her to develop it. Right now she is grateful for it. The man at the glass looked for 15 seconds. Then he stepped back, said something into a phone she hadn't seen him hold up, listened, and walked back toward the car. She watched the car. Watching the 2 men outside the karaoke bar receive a look from the man returning from her door and adjust their posture in response, a subtle shift, the quality of attention changing from searching to filing, the decision being made that whatever they were looking for was not here. She gave it another 90 seconds. The car stayed. Then it pulled away from the curb, moved north on Vermont, and was gone. The 2 men outside the karaoke bar followed on foot, unhurried. Alana stood behind her counter in the orange lamplight for 10 full seconds after they disappeared. Then she walked back through the kitchen and into the pantry. Min-suk looked up at her. She noticed that the prepared-to-move quality had left his posture. He had settled back against the rice bags with the careful deliberateness of someone choosing not to spend energy he couldn't yet replace. "Front," she said. One came around. He nodded. "Dong demon," he said. The word carried a specific weight, not fear, but something like weather. The acknowledgement of a force that had its own nature and followed its own patterns. She sat back down on the floor. The pantry felt smaller than it had 20 minutes ago. She noticed things she hadn't had the attention to notice before. The smell of the space, flour dust and cooking oil and the faint metallic edge of blood, and underneath it all the particular clean smell of the bulk salt that she used for everything, salt being one of the few things the diner bought without compromise because Miss Dolores had raised her to understand that you could cut costs in many places but salt was not one of them. "They'll come back," she said. "Not tonight," he said. "Tonight they'll assume he was moved. They'll widen the search. By morning they'll believe he either got out or," he paused. "Or the other thing." She understood the other thing without needing it spoken. She looked at the wound. The rags were holding, the bleeding had slowed to something manageable, but he needed more than rags and salt and a pantry floor and he would need it within the next several hours and they both knew this and neither of them said it directly because saying it directly would require having an answer. "My people will come before that," he said. As if reading the calculation she was running. "Before morning. They will handle the rest." She looked at him. "Your people," she said. "Yes. And when your people come," she said carefully, "what exactly happens to the diner?" Something moved in his expression. The first thing she had seen there was not assessment or endurance or the careful formal cadence of a man who chose his words by weight. It was something smaller and more human than any of those things. A recognition that the question was fair and that he was obligated to honor it. "Nothing bad," he said. "I promise you that." Alana looked at him for a long moment. She had been promised things before, by landlords, by employers, by the various systems and institutions that had managed her grandmother's life and, by extension, her own. She had a finely calibrated sense of the distance between a promise and its delivery. But there was something in the way he said it, the same precision that governed everything he said, applied now to this, that she decided, for the time being, to hold. She reached up to the shelf for another clean cloth. "Then we wait," she said. They did not speak much after that. Not from hostility. The air in the pantry had settled into something that was not comfortable exactly but was not tense either, the specific quality of silence between two people who have been through something together and have not yet had the distance to name it. Alana changed the cloth against his wound twice more through the early hours, working efficiently and without ceremony, and each time he held still in exactly the way she needed him to hold still without being asked. The salt had done its work. The bleeding had slowed to a seep, manageable, held in place by pressure and the body's own insistence on continuing. Around 2 in the morning he said, "You mopped the floor." She had been sitting with her eyes half closed, conserving something, not quite sleep. She opened them. "Yes. Before you came in here. You mopped the blood from the floor." "Yes." He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him yet. "Why?" She thought about this for a moment. It was a genuine question and it deserved a genuine answer. "Because if anyone came inside," she said, "I didn't want them to find evidence of a choice I hadn't finished making yet." He was quiet for a long moment. "That is," he said carefully, "a very particular way of thinking." "I work in a diner," she said. "You do a lot of thinking between the door and the counter." He almost smiled. She saw it. The very beginning of it, at the corners of his mouth, before the control reasserted itself. But she had seen it, and she filed it. Around 3 he told her, without her asking, that the Dong Demon group was not simply a rival. He said this as if the information had been sitting at a certain pressure inside him and the small hours of the morning and the particular quality of the silence had brought it to the point where not saying it required more effort than saying it. He said they had been moving against his family's position for 18 months. That tonight was not random. That the location, the route through the alley he had used before and had believed was unknown, the timing, none of it was accidental. Someone told them, he said. His voice was even, but underneath the evenness was something that she recognized as the specific cold of a person who has understood a betrayal and is deciding what to do with the understanding. She didn't ask who. This was not her information to push on. Does your father know? She said. A pause. He will know before sunrise. She nodded. She looked at the pantry door. Looked back at him. The man who owns this diner, she said. He's not, I need you to understand. He's not involved in anything. He just owns the lease. And the woman whose name is on it, she's my grandmother, she worked here for 19 years and she stopped. Started again. She doesn't have anything to do with anything. Whatever this is, whatever comes after, she needs to stay out of it. He looked at her directly. The measuring look, but now with something added to it, something she would not have been able to name precisely in the moment but which she would understand later as the look of a person recalibrating the nature of what they are dealing with. Not just a woman who happened to be in the right place. A woman who, in the middle of the night on a pantry floor, while managing a medical situation and a threat and the arithmetic of her own survival, had thought of protecting someone else. Your grandmother, he said. She will not be touched. Neither will this place. I give you my word. In my family, that means something specific. She held his gaze. I'm going to need to believe that. I know, he said. I would suggest, he added, with the careful formality that seemed to be his natural register even now, that you wait until morning to decide. What happens in the morning will make it easier to believe. The first light came at 5:43. Alana knew the exact time because she had been watching the clock above the pass-through window through the 2-inch gap of the pantry door since approximately 4:30, when the karaoke bar next door had finally gone quiet and the city had moved into the small, still window between the night ending and the morning beginning, when South Vermont was as close to silent as it ever got, and the particular darkness outside the windows was the darkness that comes just before the sky admits what it's about to do. She had not slept. She had moved between the pantry and the kitchen in careful intervals, checking the front window, checking the alley, doing the small things that needed doing. There was always something that needed doing in a diner, the background maintenance of a space that was used hard every day, and she had found that the doing of these things helped, that having something for her hands kept the other things manageable. Min-suk had drifted in and out of something that was not quite sleep and not quite consciousness, the body's compromise between the rest it needed and the alertness his training or his instinct or both refused to fully surrender. He was paler than he had been. The wound was stable, but he was doing a lot of work in that sentence. She was standing at the front window, looking at the street in the gray pre-dawn light, when she saw the first one turn onto Vermont from the north. A black sedan. Moving at a pace that was not fast and not slow but deliberate, the pace of something that has calculated its arrival to the minute and is arriving at the intended minute, not before and not after. Then a second one. Then a third. She counted 5 total by the time they began to fill the parking lot of Mama C's diner, pulling in with the coordinated efficiency of a formation that had rehearsed this or had performed it so many times that rehearsal was no longer necessary. They did not park randomly. They arranged themselves with the unconscious precision of people who understood space as a language and were speaking it clearly. The engines went off. All 5, nearly simultaneously. For a moment nothing happened. Then the doors began to open. The men who stepped out were dressed in dark suits, not identical, but of a similar register, the register of formality maintained as a standard rather than occasion. She counted 8 of them from the front window before she stopped counting. They moved with a quality of attention that she recognized as professional, not threatening in its manner, not aggressive, but absolute. The kind of presence that does not need to make itself felt because it simply is. They took up positions at the lot's perimeter, at the alley entrance, at both sides of the building, with the natural movement of water filling a container. Not rushed. Not announced. Then the door of the center sedan opened. He stepped out slowly. Early 60s, she estimated, silver hair combed back and set with the precision of a man who understood that presentation was a form of authority and maintained it accordingly. Dark suit, immaculate, the fabric catching the early light with the particular sheen of something that had not been bought from a rack. A heavy ring on his right hand, silver and dark stone, visible even from this distance. He moved at the pace of someone who had never in his adult life needed to hurry because the world had learned to wait for him. He stood in the parking lot for a moment. Looked at the front of the diner. Looked at the sign, which still read open, which Alana had never flipped. Then he walked toward the front door. She went to the door and unlocked it. She had imagined various versions of this moment in the hours between midnight and dawn. The things such a man might say, the demands he might make, the particular flavors of danger that might be present in his arrival. She had prepared herself, in the way she prepared herself for difficult things generally, by staying practical, by thinking about what she could control and setting aside, temporarily, what she could not. She had not prepared for the bow. He came through the door of Mama C's diner at 5:51 in the morning and stopped inside the entrance. Two of his men had come in ahead of him and now stood at the edges of the room with the still, contained quality of the others outside. The diner was empty except for Alana standing behind the counter and the man at the door and the men at the walls. He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were dark and very still, not cold, she would think later, but deep, the stillness of a great depth rather than an absence of temperature. He looked at her the way certain people look at things they intend to remember precisely. And then he bowed. It was not a nod. It was not the polite inclination of a business transaction. It was a full, deliberate bow, head down, back parallel to the floor, held for a count of 3 full seconds before he straightened. The kind of bow that, she would understand later, was called Insan in the vocabulary of what he was. A bow of profound acknowledgement, a formal recognition of a debt so significant that it required the body's full participation in the admission. The most feared man in Koreatown was bowing to a waitress in a grease-stained apron in a diner on South Vermont Avenue. Alana stood behind her counter and received it. She did not look away. She did not step back. She held her ground in the way she had held it through every difficult thing. The rent calls and the loan notices and the late nights and the numbers that never added up, with the steady, quiet posture of someone who has decided that whatever comes through the door will be met standing. When he straightened, he spoke. His English was formal and carefully constructed, each sentence placed with the same deliberateness his son used. She could hear it now, the family resemblance in the architecture of the language. "My son is alive," he said. "Because of you." She said, "He's in the pantry. He needs a doctor. A real one." "Yes," he said. "We have one waiting. He should have had one 3 hours ago." Something moved in the older man's expression, not displeasure at her directness, she thought, but something closer to its opposite. "You are correct," he said. "I am grateful you did what could be done." He gave a brief look to the two men at the walls. One of them went through to the kitchen. The man in the immaculate suit looked back at her. "I am told," he said, "that you asked for nothing. That you hid him, and treated him, and protected him, and asked for nothing in return." "I didn't know who he was," she said. "Does it matter?" She thought about this. "No," she said. "I don't think it does." He nodded. Then he said, "In my family. In our tradition. When a life is saved, there is a word. Insan. It describes what is now between us. It is not a favor. It is not a transaction. It is a bond. It means that what is mine is, in certain ways, available to protect what is yours. This diner. Your grandmother. Your safety. These things are now inside that word." He paused. "Do you understand what I am telling you?" She looked at him steadily. "I understand that you're telling me something serious." "Yes," he said. "I am telling you something very serious." From the kitchen, she heard the sounds of minsuk being helped. The careful, coordinated movement of people who knew how to move an injured person efficiently and without wasted motion. A voice, the doctors presumably, speaking in low, professional Korean. The sound of the pantry door opening fully for the first time since midnight. She didn't look away from the man in front of her. "The diner needs a product delivery at 7, she said. "And there's a blood trail I couldn't fully get in the alley. Someone will need to manage that before the morning shift starts." A pause. Then, and she saw it clearly, the brief, genuine surprise of a man who did not often encounter the unexpected, something that was not quite a smile but was what lived next door to one. "Yes," he said. "Both of these things will be managed." By 6:15, Min-suk had been moved to one of the black sedans where the doctor, a compact, efficient man who carried a bag that looked unremarkable and contained things that were not, worked with the focused brevity of someone accustomed to field conditions. The alley had been handled by two of the suit-clad men with a thoroughness that Alana, who had standards about thoroughness, observed through the back door and approved of. The produce delivery. She had called Hector at 6:20 and rescheduled to 8, which he accepted without warmth but without complaint, because she had never once in 4 years failed to have his cash ready. She was wiping the counter was clean, she was wiping it anyway, when Min-suk appeared in the front doorway. He had been given a clean shirt, black, slightly too large through the shoulders, but clean. He moved carefully, one hand at his side, but he moved on his own. The doctor stood a few feet behind him with the expression of someone professionally opposed to this decision and professionally resigned to losing the argument. He stopped at the counter. Looked at her. In the morning light, without the pantry's overhead bulb, without the blood, she could see him more clearly than she had through the night. The precise, guarded face, the dark eyes that were still measuring but measuring differently now, with something added to the calculation that hadn't been there before. "Alana," he said. Her name, formal in his mouth, the two syllables given equal weight. "Min-suk," she said. He looked at the counter between them. At the clean surface, the laminated menu stacked at the end, the napkin dispenser, the sugar holder. The ordinary furniture of an ordinary diner on an ordinary morning that was not ordinary at all. "I want to tell you," he said carefully, "that I understand what you risked. Not in the abstract. I understand the specifics. The diner. Your grandmother. Your position." He paused. "I want you to know that I understand it was not nothing." She looked at him. "It wasn't nothing," she agreed. "No," he said. "It was not." Another pause. The careful selection of words, the deliberate placement. "It will not be treated as nothing." She nodded. Outside through the front window, the morning had arrived fully now, the particular flat gold light of a Los Angeles summer morning hitting the storefronts across the street, the sign of the karaoke bar dark and silent, the wig shop's mannequins staring out with their customary blank patience. Vermont was beginning to wake up, the first buses running their early routes, the first delivery trucks making their first stops. An ordinary morning. Except for the black sedans in the parking lot and the suited men at the perimeter and the silver-haired man in the immaculate suit who was standing near the window with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at the street with the expression of someone reviewing a decision he has made and finding it sound. Min-suk was still looking at her. She noticed something she hadn't fully registered in the dark of the pantry, a small scar at the corner of his left eye, old and faded, the kind that came from something that had happened a long time ago and been incorporated into the architecture of a face so thoroughly that it had become part of the face rather than an interruption of it. "Will you be here tomorrow?" he asked. "In the diner." The question was more complicated than it appeared and they both understood this. "I'm here every day," she said. "Someone has to be." He held her gaze for a moment longer than a simple farewell required. Then he inclined his head, not the full formal bow his father had given, but its younger, more restrained relative, a gesture that was personal rather than ceremonial, made by someone still learning the full weight of what ceremony would eventually require of him. He walked out through the front door into the morning. The sedans left in the same formation they had arrived in, center car last, the others preceding it in sequence, and within 4 minutes the parking lot of Mama C's diner looked exactly as it always looked at 6:30 in the morning, which was to say empty and ordinary and slightly in need of the parking lot seal coating that Douglas Kim had been promising to schedule for 2 years. Alana stood at the window and watched them go. She stood there for a while after they were gone. Long enough for the morning to fully establish itself, for the first regular customer of the day, Mr. Patterson, 71, retired MTA, 2 eggs over easy and wheat toast, arrived every morning at 6:45 with the precision of a man who had spent 30 years operating on a schedule and could not stop now, to appear at the corner of Vermont and turn toward the diner. She watched him come. She thought about what the silver-haired man had said. The word he had used. What it meant in the specific vocabulary of what he was, not a promise, not exactly, but something older than a promise, something that had the weight of a tradition behind it rather than just an individual's intention. A structure. A thing that would continue to be true not because one man decided to honor it but because an entire system had encoded it as a requirement. She thought about Min Suk on the pantry floor. The controlled breathing. The white-knuckled grip on the shelf. The almost smile at 2 in the morning. The shoes. She thought about what she had done and what it had cost and what it had turned out to mean. She had spent 4 years making herself small. Making herself invisible. Staying out of the path of anything that had enough force to knock over something she had worked to build. She had understood this as wisdom. As a strategy. As the practical response of a person who knew what she had and what she stood to lose and took neither for granted. What she had not understood, what she was beginning to understand now, in the flat gold morning light with Mr. Patterson 40 feet from the front door, was that invisible had always been a temporary condition. That the world did not actually leave alone the things that tried to make themselves small. That staying out of the path of force was not the same as being safe. That sometimes the thing that changed your life came through the back door bleeding and all you could do was decide, fast and without complete information, who you were going to be in the moment when the choice was in front of you. She had decided. In 15 seconds in a mop and a pantry and the hours after, she had decided, and the decision had turned out to mean something she had not anticipated when she made it, and she was not yet sure what to do with that meaning, but she had it now and it was hers. Mr. Patterson reached the front door and pulled it open, the bell above it chiming the way it chimed every morning, familiar and small and specific to this place. "Morning," he said. "Morning, Mr. Patterson," she said. "The usual?" "You know it," he said, and settled onto his stool at the counter with the satisfaction of a man who has found his place and intends to occupy it. She put it in his order. Poured his coffee. Wiped the stretch of counter in front of him, which was clean, which she wiped anyway. Outside, Vermont moved into its morning rhythm. The buses, the deliveries, the first pedestrians of the day. The karaoke bar is dark and sleeping. The massage parlor's sign is off but its door is already unlocked. The ordinary life of a neighborhood doing what neighborhoods do, which is to continue. Nothing in the street looked different. Nothing in the diner looked different. The menus were laminated, the floors were clean. The coffee was good because Alana had fought for the supplier and continued to fight for the supplier because some things were not negotiable. But something had changed. She could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before it's visible. In the air, in the particular quality of the light, in something below the level of what the senses can name precisely. At 7:45, a man she had not seen before came into the diner, sat at the far end of the counter, ordered coffee, and did not leave when he finished it. He was not threatening in his manner. He was simply present, in the particular way that professional presence presents itself, still, attentive, pointing outward. An hour later, a different man replaced him with the seamless transition of something that had been arranged. She said nothing about it. She refilled the coffee. She took orders. She ran the numbers in her head and found, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that they were going to be fine. That 68 covers were going to happen today. That the produce delivery at 8 had gone smoothly and the cash had been there and the invoices were going to be manageable. Around 9 o'clock, Mrs. Huang from the massage parlor came in with a container of japchae, as she did on the last Friday of the month, except it was Thursday, which was not the last Friday of any month. She set it on the counter and looked at Alana with the particular expression of a woman who had lived in this neighborhood for a long time and noticed things and chose carefully which things she commented on. "You look tired," she said. "Long night," Alana said. "Mrs. Huang nodded, as if this was the entire explanation and also sufficient. She patted the container. "For you," she said. "Not the customers. For you." She went back to her shop. Alana looked at the japchae. Looked at the diner, the worn linoleum, the cracked vinyl repaired with electrical tape, the laminated menus, the coffee machine that was good because she had insisted on it, the regulars at their regular stools, the morning moving around her with all the ordinary insistence of mornings. And the man at the end of the counter, still and watchful, facing the door. She had not asked for this. She had not known, when she grabbed a bleeding stranger by the arms and dragged him across the kitchen floor, that she was making anything other than the only decision that felt possible in the moment when the moment required it. But here was what she was beginning to understand: the world had not agreed to her invisibility. Had never agreed to it. Had simply been waiting, in its own patient way, for the moment when her actual size became impossible to contain in the shape she had tried to keep herself. She was not invisible anymore. She was not certain, yet, what she was instead. That would take time. It would take the conversations that would come, the world she was only beginning to glimpse the outline of, the full weight of what it meant to have a word like Insan attached to your name in a vocabulary that treated such words as structural rather than decorative. But she was standing in her diner at 9 in the morning with good coffee and a clean counter and enough covers to make the numbers work, and there was a man at the end of the counter who was not going anywhere. And somewhere across Koreatown, a fleet of black sedans had returned to wherever they kept themselves, and the silver-haired man in the immaculate suit had said something is now between us and had meant it in the precise, architectural way of someone who built things to last. Alana Brooks was 27 years old. She had a student loan and a grandmother's rent and an apron with a stain above the left pocket that no amount of washing had fully removed. And she was, as of this morning, untouchable. She poured Mr. Patterson's second coffee without being asked, because she always knew when he needed the second one, and she set it in front of him, and she looked at the door of her diner in the morning light, and she waited to see what would come through it next. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going, *.